Mm.
And it's really scary because the Sankirtan movement's meant to be the antidote to the age of Kali. But I'd say quarrel is one of its biggest afflictions, at least in the modern era.
Mm.
There's so much energy spent in squabbling, and most of it is a battle of egos. Even if there may be technically someone who's more accurate than somebody else, it's a Pyrrhic victory. What have you really gained if you've humiliated and squashed another devotee or just fallen out and burnt the relationship? Often over quite a trivial matter in the scheme of things.
Episode 18 of Successful Vaishnavas. We're talking with Damodara Prabhu about the 7 habits of highly effective people. This is part 2, Public Victory. It's time to get inspired. Join us as we celebrate devotee success stories. Preaching, business, community development, leadership and personal growth, all from the point of view of Krishna consciousness. Our goal? To help you to make your life successful. Hare Krishna, this is Krishnendu Das back again for another episode of Successful Vaishnavas. This would be episode number 18. And in this episode we'll be talking to Damodara Prabhu again in the second part of our interview about the 7 habits of highly effective people by Stephen Covey. This week we'll be talking about public victory, which are the things which relate to other people. Last week it was about be proactive, begin with the end in mind, and put first things first. So it's about personal productivity and personal clarity. And now this section will be talking about how we relate with each other. And I think this is a really important point. In our survey, there were 2 main themes that came out. One was the challenge of completing our sadhana and our japa in particular, which really closely relates to the first 3 habits that we've already looked at. Now, this final 3 habits, and one more, is how we relate with others, which was the second issue that came out in the surveys that I've done, that there's a lot of challenges in the relationships that devotees have. So I think you'll find these public victory, this public victory section to be really interesting, and it will be really helpful. It's interesting, Damodara Prabhu actually shares a question that he directly asked Stephen Covey while he was still alive, and what Covey's answer was, and it's quite profound, so that's something to look forward to. In news with me, as I mentioned last week, I went to the opening of the City Impact Church. They opened a branch in our local area, and I did a Facebook Live straight away after I had that experience, where I went into a lot of detail. I'll share that in the show notes on successfulvaishnavas.com/18. But just in a nutshell, a few things I found interesting is, maybe I'll just stick to one particular point, is that they are not afraid to make a call to action. So this is kind of like marketing or sales language, but what I mean is they're not afraid to ask people to do exactly what they want them to do. So in the service that I went to, after the initial song, they immediately did the offering. And what the offering means in church is basically you hand around a plate, you could say, and people are expected to put a donation on there. So while this is about to happen, and while it was happening, the pastor who was speaking was, really encouraging people that, you should donate. It's in your own good interest. It says in the Bible that if you give to God, then you'll get so much back. And, this is in your interest. And it was interesting. He made the point that, you don't have to give to be with Jesus. Jesus is all you need. But this is for your benefit. If you do this, it's not that we're doing it for our benefit. It's the person who gives actually is the one who benefits. And of course, for myself, I was noticing that this church has got a lot of facilities. They've got 2 really big centres in Auckland of their own. They've got different branches all around the country. They've got a whole lot of different programs going on. They've got full-time employees doing different things. Where do those resources come from? It's because of this culture that they have that everyone in the community should give. It's a Christian concept called tithing. And I think the same concept is there in Christian consciousness, but I don't see it being really put into practice as much. And I think that if devotees were inspired to give donations and they could see the results of their donations, it would help the movement to spread. Of course, it depends a lot on the trust of the leadership, and perhaps that's why devotees are not giving. Or you could also argue that maybe devotees are just struggling to maintain themselves and they don't have anything to spare. But I think that that's probably not a valid argument. Everybody can always give something, and these Christians would argue that when you give to God, you'll find that more abundance comes into your life. So it was interesting how they were preaching on this angle of dealing with the material needs. They were saying that, if you have a problem with your health, touch that part of the body and, pray to God. If you have problems with your finances, touch your wallet or your pocket and, and pray to God. So it's good that they're getting people to turn to God whenever they have problems rather than turning somewhere else. And of course, a higher level is we just pray to God, please engage me in your service and do as you like. But definitely in the initial stages, people have these real material needs. And if we can recognize them and address them, then it'll help people to advance. So the first call to action was asking people to donate. And this is what was giving the economic basis for their church. The second call to action is interesting. It's at a deeper level. So at the beginning of the service, they're asking people to basically give their wallet. At the end of the service, they're asking people to give their heart. And the way that they did it was quite powerful. They would put music on which, invoked the emotions. And then they would say, so if there's anybody here today, who's listened to the sermon and been involved in the service, that feels that God is calling them, they want to, take the next step, then please look up at me on the stage and just raise your hand so that I can see who you are. Everybody else just bow down and close their eyes. So if you want to let me know, no one else will see, it'll just be you. And then he'll say this. And then he'll say, all right, so I'm just going to give you a little time. I'm going to scan the room, see who's ready to, give their life to Jesus or ready to take another step. And he's just taking his time, like really taking his time. And it's becoming a little awkward. Like if he had quickly made that statement and then you said, okay, anyone? Okay, no one today? Okay, no worries, we move on. It wouldn't have had that effect. But what he did is he made that statement and then he basically paused with this emotional music. And it really had the effect of, this is like an uncomfortable silence where people start to think to themselves, oh, yeah, maybe, and then he keeps going. And they'll say, okay, maybe you don't agree with everything I've said today, but still there's something in your heart that you feel you're not quite right with God. And I mean, pretty much everyone in this world can say that, right? That they're not right with God. That's why we're here. So I guess anyone who's honest will get that feeling. And they word it in such a way that it actually applies to everybody. And again, said, all right, so I'm just going to have another look across the room. And then one person put their hand up. So, okay, so good. One person's put their hand up. And often when the first person does that, sometimes it opens the gate for more. And eventually, he spent a long time on this process of letting people kind of sit with that thought. Am I right with God? Is it something I need to do something about? And in the end, there was like 6 people that put their hand up or, showed that they were interested in going to the next stage. So I was just wondering how that might work in Krishna consciousness. First of all, we should be clear what's the next step we want people to take, and then creating support systems so that when they do make that commitment, we're ready to help them. And also, just curious about this process. I think that we could probably be more direct with people. when we're doing our preaching, so that, we inspire people to take action. We don't just say, yeah, okay, so here's the philosophy, and if you want to do it, it's all cool, see you later. To actually give people that space to really connect with that part of themselves that they know needs to develop, and then to allow that to inspire them to advance in their spiritual life. I thought it was very powerful. A little awkward, a little uncomfortable to a certain extent. But sometimes that can be the catalyst to really make things move in your life. Anyway, so that was my experience at the City Impact Church. There would be many other things I could say, but if you wanted more details, go to the show notes at successfulvaishnavas.com/18, where I have a Facebook Live video. I go into a lot more detail and I talk on other points rather than the one I just spoke about here. But they definitely use emotions a lot. That's another factor to inspire people to take action. So I think I'll leave it there, and we'll hear again from Damodara Prabhu, this time talking about relationships and the public victory aspect of the 7 habits of highly effective people.
So together, those first 3 habits, proactivity, clear end in mind, and the discipline to put first things first, constitute what's called a private victory. So the whole idea that anything we try and achieve in the external world is fundamentally an expression of how well our inner world is ordered and disciplined. And those are just 3 kind of organizing ideas. So that then builds a platform for the public victory, which is about relationships with others. The first of those is a mindset, an attitude towards others of relating to them with both courage and consideration. It's called think win-win. So the idea that we're not just pursuing our own agenda, but we're actually thinking about how to best partner with others. In many ways, it just corresponds to the settings that Prabhupada wanted for how we associate with each other within ISKCON. The idea that we create an environment of mutual appreciation. That third purpose of ISKCON, which is about bringing the members of society together and closer to Krishna, and just to enable everyone to realize they're part of Krishna, part and parcel of Krishna, is very true. And in the Nectar of Instruction, Srila Prabhupada also talks about facilitating the loving exchanges between devotees. So this is about being able to have courageous conversations that are also respectful. Our society has a lot to learn about that.
Yeah.
A lot of time, there is almost this egotistical battle to be the winner of the argument, to be the theologically most correct.
Vitandi.
Something like that, yeah. So those 3 different kinds of argument that Srila Jiva Goswami talks about. And if we think about it, Kali is all about argument and quarrel. And it's really scary because the Sankirtan movement's meant to be the antidote to the age of Kali. But I'd say quarrel is one of its biggest afflictions, at least in the modern era. There's so much energy spent in squabbling, and most of it is a battle of egos. Even if there may be technically someone who's more accurate than somebody else, it's a Pyrrhic victory. What have you really gained if you've humiliated and squashed another devotee, or just fallen out and burnt the relationship? Often over quite a trivial matter in the scheme of things. Srila Prabhupada often berated us to be much more encouraging of each other. That doesn't mean we avoid challenging somebody if we feel there's something that needs challenging, but it can still be done a lot more artfully and in a much more conciliatory way.
Respectfully.
And you'd like to think we can create communities of great inclusion, where people genuinely feel valued and that their contribution matters and someone's looking out for them. Just basic human needs that everybody has. A lot of people seem to lament about how it was in the old days when there was more of that intimate family feel. And I think as ISKCON's grown in complexity, there's a lot more different constituent groups. They may not have the equal distribution of resources and power, and I think that's part of the challenge. But figuring out how we can discuss that in a respectful and inclusive way is actually the challenge that I think we have. And think win-win is that true commitment to my needs and expectations and point of view, but being in this multiplicity world where we're just as ready to hear from others and look out for their needs and interests, and not harbour any enmity and get into friends and enemies.
Right, yeah. So we're looking at a problem and trying to work out a solution rather than looking at other people as the problem. We try to look at it together. They're like, okay, well, how can we deal with this?
The amount of instructions that Prabhupada talks about cooperation as one of the main things he wanted, even though he acknowledged that he'd like people to have their own sovereignty and autonomy, that no one's going to dictate from on high what you do. He still wanted people to have that sense of freedom and yet choose to engage with each other. And it could be because it's very deep into the Western psyche, and I think it's part of Cully's memes around mistrust. The rugged individual who does their own thing is a really strong Western value. And it's probably been a few generations since we really knew how to relate in community. I don't know if it was during the two great wars of the 20th century where community started to break down. People don't even know their neighbours anymore. And perhaps because our lives are so busy, that extent to which we're just able to hang out together and enjoy each other's company and feel a part of something is becoming more and more alien to people.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was reading a book recently. I forget the name of it, but it's, I think, The Pendulum or something, that every 50 years or 80 years, I think it is, there's a swing more towards individualism or more towards community type of thing. And when it goes to an extreme, it causes problems. And it passes through the balance like a pendulum tends to do. It's like when you get an extreme on the community side, then privacy is not valued at all. And, you get all kinds of funny things going on. But then on the other side as well, when the individualism is too strong, that's also got its own problems.
I'm sure Srimad Bhagavatam's full of warnings about the dangers of friends and enemy kind of consciousness, that it's antithetical to devotional service. But it does seem to be a pitfall that we very easily fall into in Kali Yuga, where someone disagrees with us, we demonize. And we set out to smash. It's not exclusive to devotees. You clearly see that going on in the political sphere and other spheres as well.
Corporate world.
But it is quite ugly. And again, these are habits of highly effective people. So Covey's point is that these things aren't necessarily the innate habits of most people. They probably take a bit of cultivation. They probably take a little bit of challenging of instinct, which is why be proactive is the first principle, almost that ability to resist the urge or the instinct to behave in a particular way. Another way you could say that is first verse of Upadeshamrita. Vacha Vegam, Manasa Krodha Vegam. We've got to learn how to resist all of these urges. Only a person who's learned how to resist the urge to speak, the mind's demands, tongue, belly, genitals, etc., is actually qualified to be a teacher or a preacher. And it's quite profound, because otherwise our life is a function of sensual stimuli, mental urges.
Going right back to that first habit.
Which is animalistic life.
Yeah, totally.
And so somehow the human in us and the divine in us needs to learn how to recognize and resist all of these stimuli. So that's, eating, sleeping, mating, defending. So defending is possibly where a lot of the us and them and I have a grievance with you and let's quarrel and beat it all out. It's a weird instinct. It's probably no different to two dogs snarling at each other to try and mark out territory and just very bestial kind of urges.
Now, I'm just thinking that the first three habits are clearly private victory. And going back to the japa kind of theme, it's easy to see how those things relate to improving our japa or, that sort of thing. So how do these... for the habit we've talked about now, win-win, how does that relate to, improving our japa or our...
I think japa is very much a private victory. Obviously, you can sometimes, by clubbing together with others, reinforce your own resolve. I've always found it much easier to chant attentively in a room full of other people all trying to chant attentively. It sort of helps the mind come back. You get inspired by others' example. I think win-win mostly as a guide for how we associate with devotees. You could argue the relationship with the spiritual master is a type of win-win. It's not that the disciple wants to win, But the disciple feels that because the spiritual master is giving him an education, that he's duty bound to reciprocate, even if he'll never be able to pay the debt.
Yeah.
To render service, to engage, to please the spiritual master, and so on. And befriending devotees. So, we're told that we learn who to take shelter of and surrender to, and guided by who to befriend, who to avoid. Mm-hmm. There's no prescription anywhere who you can criticize or who you can badmouth or who's a loser. Point. It just says who to avoid, who to be merciful to, who to befriend, who to serve. And to me, all of those have an element of win-win. Even Covey talks about if you can't get to a win-win, sometimes it's better to have a no deal. Yeah. So if you do find that you're in a relationship where, for whatever reason, you just can't find any common ground or find a respectful dynamic between the two of you, then have a respectful distance. Again, it's there in Upadeshamrita, text 5. Even the sahajya should be respected within one's mind. Wow. So don't hang out with them. But appreciate that they chant Hare Krishna.
Yeah.
And it would be so good if we were able to understand at a deep ethical level just how important it is to have, one of the descriptions of a devotee in the Bhagavatam is Suridam Sarva Bhutana. Is that? Suridam Sarva Dehinam. Anyway, to be a friend to all living creatures. Tatikshava Karunika, Suridam Sarvadehinam. Was that it? Anyway,
I think so,
something like that. A well-wishing friend of all. Prabhupada used to sign his letters, "You're ever well-wisher."
Yeah.
So that concept of dedicated to ridding my life of any enmity, any ill will.
The one who is an advanced person is the one who is free from the desire to criticize others or propensity to criticize others.
Doesn't even have the propensity.
Yeah.
Wow. The instinct, the urge never arises.
And that's called Vaishnavananda, which is, if you want to talk about the chanting, you go back to the 10 offences.
Right.
A big chunk of the offences is related to that relationship and the win-win type of stuff.
Yeah, how can we please the holy name?
Vaishnava, aparad.
Yeah. How can we please the holy name if we're falling out with his loved ones?
Yeah, and conversely, if we please the devotees and get their blessings, how Krishna will be pleased with us. There's, I think, a story where even one of the Goswamis accidentally offended someone, like by laughing or something. Then when there was chanting, something's not happening right. There's some feeling that's, and then he found out, oh, sorry, you misunderstood me. When I was laughing, you thought I was laughing at you. I was laughing about something else, and everything returned to normal.
It's an interesting one, because just thinking about it, we have Amanina Manadena Kirtaniya Sadahari. Don't want something for yourself, but be prepared to give all consideration to others. And I think sometimes we have that weird idea of humility that we tolerate unacceptable things. Now, while tolerance is praised as a virtue, within this concept of win-win, the idea of speaking your truth is also there, but it's done with the deepest regard for the person that you're addressing. Which, of course, would also help your point land. So the whole idea is, if, what you're saying has all of this venom, delivered along with it, chances that the other person will be open to your point of view or even hear it are reduced. Whereas if you're able to balance the courage to speak your truth with the consideration and the empathy, Prabhupada also used to use the expression, speak the truth, but speak it kindly, or whatever. I've just forgotten it right now. Yeah.
I mean, in the Bhagavad Gita, it has that verse, Priyam Bruyat,
Satyam Bruyat. Yeah, Priyam Bruyat. So exactly, that was the one I was trying to remember. So that conveys that idea of think win-win, that you want what you want, but you want something in the collective interest. So you're not so busy thinking about your own glorification, your own accomplishments, whatever praise will come to you, but you're always thinking of the collective well-being.
And I think that it sort of segues nicely into the next habit there, when you're talking about, that you're talking, the other person's not even hearing what you have to say because of the way you're presenting your message.
So on the basis of the first of the public victory habits, think when Covey then says that one of the best expressions of that is our listening to others. He describes it as seek first to understand, then be understood. I mean, it pretty much corresponds to Shravan, then Kirtan. Whatever it is that we're expressing is a result of what we've imbibed. And so if we haven't particularly listened well, chances are our solutions or our prescriptions may be flawed or incomplete in some ways. So it's a real discipline and potentially an expression of really giving someone high regard, to put aside one's own inner chatter, even one's own prejudices and points of view, and give them your time and attention, and earnestly try to understand where they're coming from. To me, I mean, it would be one of the greatest qualities of any preacher, is they've really understood the other person's situation so as to make Krishna consciousness especially relevant. I think it's a big challenge for our society. How well do we understand the mindset of the people we're seeking to engage? Are we still trotting out a formula that worked in 1971, but have lost touch with, the pulse of today? That doesn't mean we're, serving up alcohol and Tinder for people. But it does mean that we couch things in the language that resonates with people, that it touches raw nerves and felt issues that they have. And we can only do that if we've actually listened to them. It's an interesting one, because we're told to sort of avoid non-devotee association, and yet the preacher takes all kinds of risks, Srila Prabhupada would say. And one of those risks, I think, is to at least enter their world far enough that you can meet them there, gain rapport, and then lead them somewhere different.
The example of Prabhupada, he was talking to a racing car driver or something, and he said, "Oh, wow, that must be really dangerous. Don't you ever feel afraid?" Or, and then from there, it was a natural connection.
And that's it, finding that way to build rapport and connection. We often hear criticism of ISKCON's leaders that they don't listen. And I think if we haven't first mastered time management and recognized the importance of relationships, then we may underestimate just how much attention people need, or their expectations, or the extent to which possibly they might feel shortchanged and we didn't hear them out fully, or that we too quickly got defensive and we disagreed too quickly with what they said before they'd really felt heard.
Or give a glib answer because you're just interpreting their question, which has nothing to do with what they're really asking.
Yeah, again, how does it relate to japa? I think it probably relates more to reading Prabhupada's books. Like, if we're not immersing ourselves in
hearing
the complete messages that Srila Prabhupada gave us, then chances are we might not still be fresh. I actually once asked Stephen Covey a question, and it was quite a profound answer. I said, "You've been teaching all this stuff for 30 years, Stephen. How do you keep it fresh?" And he came back with just one line, didn't ever give me a purport to it. I later learned it was actually a quote from C.S. Lewis, the Narnia guy.
Right.
He said, "Well, the more you listen to your conscience, the more it demands of you." And I thought that's pretty profound, actually. That freshness, remaining vital and relevant and authentic and real, means that we almost have to be constantly immersed in that original sound, vibration and charge. And that's why Prabhupada did spend so much time. So I think the gift of the holy name is probably better appreciated. I feel like there's a Kirtan revival movement and everything. I think the gift of Prabhupada's books is still underinvested around the place. Not everyone, obviously. There's wonderful book distributors and there are wonderful students. But if you think about the total universe of devotees and how many of them regularly bathe in the nectar of Srila Prabhupada's books, I'd say that we're often shortchanging ourselves. And I think this habit's also especially relevant to a leader, to help people feel valued and that their contribution and opinion matters and that they have something worthwhile to contribute. And also to a preacher, if they really want to have that sense of a connection with people and people to feel that what they're saying resonates and is relevant. We're often so busy wanting to get our own message across, especially if we're convinced that we're right, or that we're wise, or that we're learned, or whatever. that we can underplay what other people have to contribute and have them feel left out.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because you've got the sort of the external part of it and dealing with other people, but that idea that you're talking about hearing from Krishna, through Prabhupada's books, or even if we just take the japa itself, we can be rattling the sounds off, but if we're not hearing, then we're not really doing the proper. It's not really japa. It's not the proper meditation.
And I'm no expert, but what I've noticed is there is some kind of reciprocal encouragement that you get from the holy name by way of taste and engagement when you listen. Even to the point where, having read a little bit of Harinam Chintamani, it would appear that one of the main distinctions between Namaparana and Namabhas is the effort to be free from offences. And if we've slipped into sort of lazy, inattentive chanting, we're practically making no effort. We've almost surrendered to, our mind just doing its own thing, and chanting is almost at a mechanical activity going on in the background. Whereas if we're making the effort to listen and hear, that in itself makes it more of a meditative practice. It's also described in the Srimad Bhagavatam, Srinvatam Swakata Krishna, and Srila Prabhupada translates Srinvatam as eager to hear. So that earnest desire to hear is seemingly what Krishna reciprocates with. Many of the offences, like it talks about maintaining material attachments even after hearing so many instructions. Well, maintaining material attachment isn't just something you can switch off like a switch. It actually is, I'm probably maintaining a load of attachments I'm not even conscious I'm maintaining. Right. And so the ability to become fully free from offences clearly needs a lot of assistance from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. We have to simply make the effort. Yeah, it seems like that effort is one of the main distinguishers between the clearing stage and the complete apparat stage.
Yeah, deliberately removing them, like you say, it doesn't seem to be a direct process. It's more like a displacement process. By fully absorbing our mind with Krishna, then there's no more room for those things. But if we are inattentive, then we're allowing that space for it to come in.
I think that it's almost like you've invited a dignitary to your home, but then you're making them stand in a queue along with everybody else. It gets a bit of your attention when it suits you or when you've a mind. Probably won't come again. Now, Krishna is very merciful. He won't necessarily just drop us like that. Yeah. But I definitely do find that there is some kind of reciprocation when our hearing is switched on.
Yeah, to me it's quite a bit unfortunate in terms of this inattention that every day at the temple, the way that the 10 offences are recited, it said, there's another offence, it's inattention, as if it's an afterthought. Whereas actually it's the root cause of all the other offences, according to Bhaktivinoda Thakur, I believe, and it is one of the 10 offences. Somehow or other, the way the 10 offences are recited on a daily basis, at least the temples I've been to, it makes it like it's the 11th offence, but it's one of the 10 offences in Harinam Chintamani. Yeah. And maybe it doesn't get the emphasis that it needs. It's such an important point.
But I also want to emphasise, because I think one of your big questions was, how do these habits potentially enable community? I suppose a sense of feeling included, feeling involved, feeling cared for, feeling like one's contribution matters is a big part, I think, of what keeps people engaged. And so that has so much to do with whether they feel heard. Mm-hmm. So another reason why I think that inflammatory argument, quarrel kind of thing needs to go. Most of the time, devotees will actually agree on 99.999% of things, but for some reason, all the contention over the things they disagree. And if we just heard each other out, I imagine even some of those contentions would disappear. Yeah. There's a lot of people who have a lot of hurts from various traumas that may have happened to them over the time in ISKCON. I know myself, I'm tempted often to try and set them straight philosophically. Maybe empathy would get me a whole bunch further. Yeah. Because sometimes you're just trying to ease a wounded heart as opposed to straighten a crooked intellect. And if the heart's unsettled, it can often hijack the intellect. So we're trying to make this cognitive, rational argument not realizing that while ever that person's in a hurt state, they can't afford to take on board the points that we're making, because that would just be too painful to bear.
Even from a marketing point of view, they say that decisions are not made through the intellect; they're made through the emotions. And if you try to get into details and technical stuff, then you'll never be able to convince someone of anything. And it's a bit like if we get all philosophical, then we're going into that intellectual part of the brain. It's not the part of our psyche that makes us go, yes, I'm going to do that. It's kind of interesting idea,
Yeah, so we want to have the courage of an English colonel, but the heart of a Bengali mother, right?
Yeah.
So that heart is very much what those first two habits in the public victory: think win-win.
Yeah.
I matter, you matter too. Seek first to understand. How do you see things? All right, here's my opinion now.
Yeah.
Even in Indian society, elders will often speak last because they don't want anyone to feel that we're now contradicting them or to shut down the conversation. Yeah. So habit 6 is very much about problem solving and coming up with ideas that are greater than the sum of the parts. He calls it synergize. As we know, one of Srila Prabhupada's greatest talents, amongst his many, many talents, was this ability to engage people according to their strengths, according to their nature, often push people beyond what they believe they could possibly do, but somehow create an environment where everyone could fit. We often have these, great statements: he made a house in which the whole world can live. And so this is a really important habit, because more often than not, we like to surround ourselves with people that agree with us and share the same views. But this would be about being able to appreciate diversity, and in a community, a way that recognizes the value of everyone's contribution and potentially helps come up with collective works of devotion. Like for me, one of the best applications, and this is something I dream of doing in the future, is create temple Istaghostis. Istaghostis have often degenerated now into like a let's talk out a problem, or here's the temple notice board, or something like that. How do we organize the roster for cleaning up one Gundicha Mads in the day or something? And I'd love to think, we could have facilitated community vision statements where the whole community is invited to participate in authoring where does this place go, so they can all feel like this is our collective work of love together, as opposed to, this is something that those leaders and those few very active community members have stolen the show and I'm just an outsider.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that would be an expression of synergizing. And the final habit, which is probably less to do with the public and private victory, often pictured as holding the whole things together, is this whole idea of renewal, that we have a physical body that should be kept in fit condition. It's an instrument of Krishna's loaned to us. And, do we want to have the greatest duration of life through eating wisely, resting, drinking enough water, just doing the self-care kind of activities, exercise of some kind? Like Srila Prabhupada, after his heart attacks, I think was advised by a physician that he should have a daily walk at his age. Right. And he took that on as a daily discipline. Yeah. He was very, very meticulous in what he ate.
Well, that whole routine we talked about earlier, a big part of it is didn't sleep much, but when you're older, maybe you don't need to sleep as much. That part blows my mind. But he had his naps, he had his massages, he was particular about what he used to eat, like you're saying. A lot of it was based around, self-care, because he knew that I've got this important service of translating these books. I have to look after myself.
But it's also energy management. So he was thinking about, how do I re-energize myself sufficiently to have endurance and stamina, because this was a pretty heavy program he was committing to. Yeah. So those naps and those massages were an integral part of being able to keep going. But the physical aspect is only one of the aspects. So this really much corresponds to the Gita hierarchy of you've got matter, you've got the senses, you've got the mind, you've got the intellect, you've got the soul. So one of the other dimensions that Covey argues we should refresh is the social emotional dimension, so relationships. So particularly thinking about which are the relationships we want to invest in and nurture, and making sure we're doing that regularly. Again, including almost taking stock of what's the quality of my family relationships, and am I doing the necessary work on those, having the conversations I need to have, spending time, but also one's immediate sangha. If you're a temple manager, it might be thinking through who are all the especially valued constituents I should be spending time with. I don't want anyone to be feeling unloved. There's the mental stroke intellectual level, which is about feeding our minds. So that could be whether we're learning new skills. Again, if you're a temple manager, there might be various skills that are a vital part of your job, like even just knowing how to read a spreadsheet so you can manage the temple finances effectively. We shouldn't, cock our nose at these capabilities because they're mundane. If we're employing them in the service of Krishna, Krishna deserves the best management possible. And so there could be skills like that. Obviously, reading Srila Prabhupada's books is a way of feeding the mind. Potentially even other studies. If we're a householder and we're not happy earning what we're earning, how are we preparing our CV and our learning to potentially take on another responsibility or something that could add greater value? And the other aspect that Covey calls out is spiritual. In this case, he's a bit, vague about spiritual. It could be, a charity you serve or just renewing your value system. It's very clear for a devotee what that means. And the idea is that he calls it sharpen the saw. If you literally just keep on sawing away, eventually the saw goes blunt. And most people treat their material bodies, their minds, their relationships, and to some extent even their soul as a resource to be utilized, very rarely reinvesting to keep it in that peak condition. And many people experience a sort of flabbiness, whether it's don't know how to learn anymore, don't even know how to think anymore. I mean, we see more and more mental illness nowadays, we see more and more early senility nowadays, because people have almost abused these facilities. And devotees also aren't immune. We're not immune to the ravages of old age. We read about birth, death, old age, and disease, and we prattle it off as part of our philosophy. But a time comes when we get confronted with these things, and if we've not eaten well, and exercised appropriately, and kept our minds in peak condition, we may well pay a price of a blunt mind or a blunt body. A sick body. I mean, there's a lot of devotees who have health problems because they haven't been attentive to their diet or exercise. I think it's a thing for monks generally. I believe, for instance, Kung Fu and these ancient martial arts were designed initially just as a way of keep fit for monks because they just had this sedentary lifestyle. So I think it's...
Well, it's like yoga is also, what we know of as yoga today is meant to keep the body in fit condition for meditation, basically.
And sharpen the saw can also be applied to the society. So are we refreshing our systems, our outlook, our perspective, or have we fallen into the routine of drudgery? So somehow involved in continuous improvement at all levels, personally, professionally.
Prabhupada talks about fresh challenge. Try to inspire the idea of a fresh challenge. They're always there's always something to get you motivated, right?
So looking at these assets as stewardships, heart, body, mind, intellect. Intellects that are tools that can be sharpened, honed, or can be just kind of let go if we're lazy. Again, we're really swimming against the tide to, why do we have an epidemic of obesity and various other things these days? Because most people are engaged elsewhere. They're mostly enjoying the facilities and not looking at self-preservation.
So they just eat whatever happens to come in front of them and not really thinking too much about what they're doing with their exercise or, different things like that. It's just unconscious living, basically.
And it's fantastic. You'll see all of these, wacky schemes that people have to lose weight without eating right and exercise. Vibrating belts and jiggling platforms and, sewing their stomachs shut, cutting flesh off or sucking fat out. I mean, people who do anything other than make the effort. Again, Srila Prabhupada's example is perfect. He didn't overemphasize looking after the body, do enough to keep body and soul together. He used every last ounce of his energy, but you could see that conscious maintenance. This is a facility that Krishna's given me, so let me look after it. Arguably it's an attitude that we could better exercise with regards to the look and appearance and upkeep of temple properties and gardens. Cars. I think sometimes there's a funny expression. I remember Shonaka Rishi Prabhu from the Oxford Centre once said that the Archbishop of Canterbury said, "My priests are so heavenly minded they're of no earthly use." And this is often the case, that we're so transcendental that sometimes we're not taking care of the things in our immediate vicinity, being otherworldly. Anyway, so that's a bit of an overview of the 7 habits and how it might. I mean, having a regular reflection on your japa quality would be an interesting sharpener. So I'd say the daily reading of Prabhupada's books, lectures, I find I get a lot of value out of listening to devotee podcasts or SoundCloud streams. It's one of the great things about technology is it's so easy to be completely immersed if we're disciplined in Krishna consciousness. If you're focused with your Facebook feeds, you can whittle it down to only positive inputs. You could literally spend many hours a day listening to Krishna Katha very easily. So these are just 7 ideas to play with. I think are really favourable for devotees.
Yeah, I think it's good that whole sharpening the saw concept of doing the things that renew you and keep your energy going, to keep it fresh. Because the material mode of passion is kind of like, you do something for a while, it's like, I want to do something new. So okay, well, let's do something new, but don't lose sight of that original goal that you've got. Interesting.
Well, like Srila Prabhupada also talked about dead men can't preach. So it's a pretty heavy statement that he was making.
Right.
But his daily meditation on the instructions of his spiritual master, he said, we should take our purpose from the lotus mouth of the spiritual master and meditate on how to execute it. And even if it may not be possible to immediately execute, if that's where our entire meditation is, then we'll remain fresh and vital. Even though
looking for those opportunities where we can.
30 years passed before Srila Prabhupada really showed some clear external fruits to all of his labours, but his determination and prowess hadn't diminished. He'd not lost one bit of edge.
His intent was sharp.
Whereas he contrasted that, even went with society back into London and funding that was provided, couldn't produce a result. I'm not saying that's exactly the source of the dead men can't preach, but that vitality, that spark, that touchstone wasn't there.
It's interesting, that concept, that because Prabhupada kind of had to fight for it, that also, it gives it a little bit of life as well. There's a danger that when everything's kind of given on a plate to you, like you're just talking, it's slightly off topic, but when you're kind of like, here, everything's here for you, you just go and you can do your thing. It's when things are a bit too comfortable. I was talking about this with a devotee the other day about, when you're in a business and, you have to make it work, kind of thing. And there's, sort of some sort of pressure and you have to fight for it. There's one expression that when you have a good fight, the victory is all that more satisfying. But just the concept of that fresh challenge again, when something's, if you have to fight for it, it gives you life. It's like, okay, I'm going to do this. Let's do this for Krishna, as opposed to, everything's just cruisy and it's all just kind of, laid in front of you. I mean, there's an expression, I think Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur said it, that an ease, loving life and Krishna consciousness go ill together, or something like this.
Should probably say something like that in Bhagavad Gita purport. I forget where, but yeah.
Just one other point I was thinking about, like in relation to the renewing. You were talking about how you can be on Facebook or SoundCloud and you can hear, and you're surrounded by Krishna consciousness. I think one danger with depending on media like that is that you are hearing what is given to you. It's like the difference between TV.
Not interactive.
You're not choosing. You're listening to whatever the medium gives you. So
it's more passive.
Yeah, it's not. It's not systematic, and it's not intentional in a way. Now you might choose. Okay, I'm going to listen to this particular person because they're doing a series on nectar and devotion, and I really want to absorb myself in understanding that book. So that idea of being intentional about the way that you learn things. I think that looking at Facebook, you can see pictures of deities and nice quotes, but it's kind of random.
Oh yeah.
But if we really want to absorb Prabhupada's books, Prabhupada talked about systematically educating people, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's something really important, that we can't just sort of substitute, I'm hearing slokas here and there and I'm listening to random bhajans and talks. That systematic element, I think it's quite a useful thing to consider.
Well, also one of the other things that's often not stressed enough is the role of inquiry. So the idea of interacting with the person that you're hearing from, that you're placing relevant questions, whether that's about your doubts or misgivings or just broader things, so that, again, it's not passive, you're very actively engaged. I know that there was a practice around reading Srila Prabhupada's books that I picked up from Krishna Dharma and Chintamani Dharma in the UK.
They have a website where they promote that now. I don't know if you've seen it. And
look, I can't remember the precise provenance of it. They would probably be able to speak better. But I remember we sort of very much thought of it as an expression of habit 5, that seek first to understand, then be understood. We'd read Srila Prabhupada's purport, then each of us would speak what we understood it to mean.
Right.
And then before the next person spoke, they would paraphrase what the last person had said. And it's a really juicy way of deepening one's engagement with the books. It quickly highlights if there's some passage that we've not understood, and potentially you can have a meeting of minds around what it means. And when Srila Prabhupada talks about discussing his books threadbare, I love that. Srila Prabhupada uses such amazing, metaphor words sometimes. The whole idea of a carpet that's so well worn that, all the threads are coming apart.
It's like that. You can imagine the Bhagavad Gita, the pages are kind of falling apart because it's been so well read,
Yeah, we've got right down to, almost an atomic level of dissection.
Right.
And I've certainly found that a really, really rewarding and, as you say, a less passive, more active way of imbibing Krishna consciousness. I still think you can even take a spirit of inquiry to listening, even if it's just listening. But I absolutely accept that to progress systematically through the books, I mean, there's a reason that those 12 cantos are written in that particular order. There was a structured meta structure that Srila Vyasadeva put down. There's a systematic way in which the various acharyas have commented, which are all synthesized in Srila Prabhupada's purports. Even the logic of the first Bhagavad Gita, then Srimad Bhagavatam, then Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, as a progressive study of deeper realization. It's not just have I had a vague exposure to Krishna Katha. There is something about going through and acquiring systematically.
Yeah, one of the things I've been thinking about lately is how the difference between living in a temple and how we're mostly all living today, is that there's a certain amount of environmental learning that takes place. Just being in that environment, bumping into devotees, attending that regular program in the morning, continuing those discussions throughout the day as you naturally do over prasadam or whatever. And there's certain lifestyle, cultural things that a lot of devotees are not even aware of now because they've never lived in a temple and sort of experienced some of those things. So I'm hoping that there's some elements of that can be compensated for or sort of revived, through some educational programs. It could be either online or in person. But there'll always be some things that you'll never quite get, if you don't have that actual live-in experience,
Well, the brahmacari ashram, and same with brahmacharya ashram, are things that could do with a refresh around what's the design, what's the deliverable from the temple's part, what's the responsibility on the other person's part, what rules apply, how do we conclude that phase in a planned, designed manner, as opposed to it almost being a haphazard or abrupt shift for which no one seems to be adequately prepared.
I was thinking like the Mormons, they have their 2 years of mission, and then things are really waiting to help them make that transition.
Well, I definitely think that a lot more design thinking needs to go into our communities. The brahmacari ashram in ancient Vedic times produced people of one of three subsequent professions: Brahmins, Kshatriyas, or Vaishyas. There may not be much of a Kshatriya occupational opportunity at the moment, but certainly plenty of need for Vaishyas. And many people are coming out of the other end of the brahmacari brahmacharini ashram, and figuring out how to solve the economic question without having given any thought prior, and often then settling into a pattern that's suboptimal. And if they haven't, as you suggested, learned some really good disciplined habits while living in the brahmacari ashram that carry over into the grihastha ashram, then most of the woeful depictions of the grihastha ashram mentioned in the Bhagavatam, dark well comes to mind, play out.
Yeah.
And it can be a 30-year detour from the straight and narrow of Krishna consciousness.
Yeah.
Or more. Longer. That assumes that you've at least maintained some awareness.
Yeah.
That when you come out of the other end, you'll be back on the path. So that really setting people up for life, that the ashram, it's not the ashram's responsibility necessarily to create employment for people downstream, but I like to think that level of societal design was taken on board potentially by all community members. All elders should have enough life experience and sense of the need. I mean, Srila Prabhupada, for instance, envisioned the issues that we'd have in Grihastha ashram just around maintaining a living and raising kids in the right setting.
Yeah.
And his solution was the simple living farms. I really think most Grihasthas are paying a hefty price for the fact that not enough energy was put into that.
Yeah.
My hat goes off to the devotees who are making endeavours in those spaces, and you kind of hope within a few generations that actually may be a viable option for many more people, on the basis that, there's some nice sustainable projects coming out of it. But it hasn't become the stipend of the Grihastha ashram, and most of us are making our way in a pretty harsh world.
Yeah, just
Uga karma.
Yeah. Just trying to get the bread on the table somehow or other.
Well, and it is a shocker how, with that advancement that now, commuting longer, working longer, almost all quality of life is squeezed out. So if we haven't got a real grip on Sangha, sadhana, we're in trouble.
Yeah, so maybe we could just recap just quickly what the 7 habits are.
All right. So pro-acting, if it is to be, it's up to me. beginning with the end in mind. If I decide my life is what I want to make of it, then what in fact do I want to make of it? Putting first things first, the things that matter most shouldn't be the mercy of things that matter least. Think win-win. I matter, but you matter too. Seek first to understand, then be understood. Well, I'll hold on to my point of view till I've understood yours. Synergize. I'm sure we can come up with something better than we could have achieved individually if we pool our creative genius. And sharpen the saw, refreshing and renewing all the gifts that Krishna has given us to keep vital and fresh. 7 ideas that Srila Prabhupada perfectly exemplified. And certainly, if you're going to read books beyond those of Srila Prabhupada and other acharyas, I'd put 7 Habits on probably one of the top 5 worth, just because it can be so supportive. And in fact, I think in some ways it provides a lot of light on issues that plague our society and many of the individual practitioners, some of the struggles that we've spoken about here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's great. I think we really explored in a lot of depth, more than I even imagined. So we talked about japa, but we also looked a lot at the society and how it can help issues in our society. And in the survey that I did recently, these are probably the 2 biggest themes that kept on coming up again and again is how can I manage my sadhana in the society we have today? And then how can I deal with these relationships with devotees and institutional things? And I think by using these 7 habits, it's a great tools that we can use to really help both of these things, personally as well as for our society. So thanks a lot.
Thank you for engaging me.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Okay, so that was the public victory section of our interview with Damodara Prabhu. I hope you found it inspiring, and I hope you found it thought-provoking. If you have any comments or questions, please leave it as a comment on the website, or if you prefer, you can make a comment on the Facebook page. You'll find there's a post related to this episode. And I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts, and if there's anything you agree with or don't agree with, or you want to go any further into these subjects, that would be really great to have that interaction with you. And otherwise, if you're interested to know when our next podcast is going to come out and you'd like to get an email that tells you about it, and you'd also like to be kept informed of any courses or other programs that are coming up, please go to successfulvaishnavas.com. You'll see that there's 4 buttons. You can choose what matches your case, your situation the best, and then we'll send you emails and keep you up to date. So we'll leave it there for this week. Until next week, make your life successful. Hare Krishna. Thanks for listening. To find out more, go to successfulvaishnavas.com.
Whatever little service that anyone can do for Krishna is to be appreciated and celebrated.
Just give this life to Krishna.
We know that they have much more potential than they're presently using.
I went to a place of relishing the activity and letting go of the result completely.
You just associate with pure devotees. Then you shall be able to cross over the ocean of Nissan.